Deep beneath the cold waters of the Barents Sea, encased in darkness and pressure, lies a nuclear-powered warship unlike any other. It is not just any submarine. It is a message from the past, sealed for over a year, waiting to reveal secrets that would shake the world and challenge everything we thought we knew about one of the most catastrophic military disasters of the modern era. When scientists finally breached its hull and lifted it from the ocean floor, what they discovered inside defied every assumption about that fateful day. This is the story of the Kursk, the Cold War's most terrifying tomb. The year is 2000, and tensions between the superpowers may have eased, but the machines of war still existed beneath the waves. Nuclear-powered missile submarines became the key to deterrence for both the Western world and the Soviet Union. These were not ordinary vessels. They were carriers of apocalypse, designed to remain hidden in the depths for months at a time, armed with enough firepower to end civilization. The Kursk was one of the most formidable examples of this deadly technology, an Oscar II class submarine that stretched over 510 feet in length, nearly as long as 2 football fields. Placed end to end, it weighed almost 19,000 tons when submerged, roughly twice the displacement of a large destroyer. Deep within its steel hull churned 2 pressurized water nuclear reactors, mammoth engines that drove steam turbines and twin propellers, giving the boat the ability to cut through the water at exceptional speeds and remained completely hidden beneath the surface for up to 120 days at a time. But the Kursk was more than just a nuclear-powered ship. Along the outside of its pressure hull, concealed behind angled doors like a terrible secret waiting to be unleashed, sat 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles. Each one measured approximately 33 feet in length, weighed several tons, and was built to fly hundreds of miles at very high speeds toward large surface ships. These missiles could be fitted with either conventional high-explosive warheads or, and this was the terrifying part, nuclear warheads capable of obliterating entire fleets. They were designed to be fired in coordinated groups, sharing targeting information between missiles so they could identify and destroy the most valuable vessel in an enemy formation, usually the aircraft carrier. This was the weapon that Western naval planners feared above all others. The Kursk carried them in abundance, making it one of the most dangerous warships ever built. Atop its massive missile battery, the Kursk's bow held 8 torpedo tubes. 4 were of standard size, designed for regular torpedoes, but 4 were wider, built specifically for heavy torpedoes meant to kill large ships with a single devastating strike. Those wider tubes could launch both torpedoes and rocket-powered anti-ship or anti-submarine missiles. Officially, all of these weapons could be armed with nuclear warheads if the situation demanded it, but by the late 1990s, the Navy that owned this monster submarine was in a state of near collapse. The Soviet Union had crumbled into history, and the Russian Navy that inherited its vessels struggled with a crippling lack of funding, manpower, and resources. Submarines sat rusting at their moorings, barely maintained. Sailors went unpaid for months. Training time at sea dropped precipitously, meaning that crews had fewer and fewer opportunities to practice the complex, dangerous maneuvers required to operate advanced weapons systems. The Northern Fleet, based on Russia's northwest coast, was the shadow of what it had once been, a proud force reduced to threads by poverty and neglect. Yet that same fleet still wanted to prove to the world that it remained a serious blue water navy capable of operating far from home in deep water. In August of 2000, commanders scheduled an ambitious naval exercise called Summer X, the first major operation of that scale since the Soviet Union's collapse. The drill would involve more than 50 ships and submarines, 40 support vessels, and around 80 aircraft and helicopters. It was meant to be a show of force, a demonstration that despite everything, the Russian Navy still had teeth. The Kursk was selected as one of the stars of this exercise, assigned to showcase its capabilities alongside a crew that had recently been praised as the finest in the entire Northern Fleet. On the first day of summer execs, the Kursk demonstrated its capabilities by successfully firing a Granite missile equipped with a dummy warhead. The test went perfectly. With that milestone accomplished, the plan for the next phase was straightforward and seemingly routine. The submarine would reposition itself to a new location in the Barents Sea, approximately 85 miles off the fleet's main naval base at Severomorsk, and there it would conduct practice torpedo firings against a target vessel, the Podor Veliki, a nuclear battlecruiser and the flagship of the entire Northern Fleet. The weapon selected for this key practice shot was a Type 65K heavy torpedo, a massive weapon over 30 feet in length, designed specifically to home in on the wake of a large surface ship and destroy it with a single warhead impact. But there was something dangerous about this weapon, something that other navies had abandoned long ago as too unstable and unreliable. The Type 65K used high-test peroxide as part of its fuel system. High-test peroxide is essentially a highly concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, one of the most unstable chemical compounds in modern military arsenals. In normal operation, this liquid breaks down inside the torpedo's engine into superheated steam and oxygen gas, which then ignite and burn with kerosene fuel to propel the weapon forward at crushing speeds. The specific torpedo loaded into one of the Kursk's white torpedo tubes on that August morning had a fatal flaw, a microscopic defect that would change everything. A faulty weld in the torpedo's casing had created a small crack. Through this crack, the high-test peroxide had been slowly seeping into areas where it had no business being. When that seeping fuel finally made contact with metal surfaces that acted as a catalyst for the chemical reaction, the peroxide did not gradually break down. It detonated with violent, instantaneous force. Just before 11 o'clock in the morning on August 12, 2000, seismic sensors stationed across northern Europe registered something unusual: a small underwater blast in the Barents Sea. The shockwave measured approximately 2.2 on the scale used to measure earthquakes, roughly equivalent to 100 to a few hundred pounds of TNT detonating. In isolation, it was not a particularly large explosion, but for those aboard the Kursk, it was catastrophic. The blast occurred inside the forward torpedo room. It blew off both the inner and outer doors of the affected torpedo tube, tore through the submarine's first compartment like a hot knife through butter, and ignited a raging fire that spread immediately into the second compartment through ventilation ducts. Everyone working in those forward spaces died in that first instant or within mere seconds of the initial explosion. The shock and violence were such that human bodies could not survive it. In the control room and nearby compartments, crew members felt an enormous concussive force. Lights flickered and died, equipment shook and rattled, alarm klaxons erupted in deafening wails, and the bow of the submarine began its inexorable descent into darkness and cold. But the absolute worst was still to come. The fire that had started in the forward torpedo room continued to spread, and in those packed compartments where weapons were stored, the heat became unbearable. Between 5 and 7 more torpedo warheads, still loaded in their tubes, began to cook off almost simultaneously in response to the rising temperatures. Their combined detonation created a second explosion measured at approximately 4.2 on the seismic scale, roughly equivalent to 2 to 3 tons of TNT, more than 200 times more powerful than the initial blast. That second explosion was the one that truly destroyed the Kursk. The second blast tore open a gaping hole in the submarine's bow section, crushed bulkheads that were meant to be crush-proof, and completely collapsed the first 3 compartments into a twisted mass of ripped steel and wreckage. The force of the detonation was so tremendous that a large chunk of the submarine's nose was driven backward into the vessel itself, leaving a terrifying wound in both the outer shell and the pressure hull. The front of the submarine, driven by sheer momentum and gravity, plowed forward into the soft seabed 108 meters below the surface, roughly 350 feet down. But behind that obliterated bow section, something miraculous happened. The rest of the pressure hull held together. On the surface, nearby Russian naval vessels felt the shocks, and some crew members heard strange underwater sounds that registered on sonar equipment, but in the initial confusion, no one fully understood what had happened. Commanders believed the exercise was still proceeding normally. It was not until early evening, after the Kirks missed several scheduled radio check-ins and attempts to contact the submarine by underwater telephone went unanswered, that the Northern Fleet finally accepted the horrible truth. Something catastrophic had occurred. An emergency was declared, and rescue ships and aircraft began sweeping the exercise area. But precious hours had already been lost. By the early morning hours of August 13th, a specialist vessel carrying deep diving equipment reached the suspected location of the disaster and lowered a small rescue submarine to investigate. That mini-submarine actually collided with the Kursk's stern section, damaging itself badly in the process, and had to be brought back to the surface for repairs. Another rescue craft was dispatched, but was sent on the wrong heading and missed the wreck site entirely. Back at the home base in Severomorsk, family members of the crew waited in anguish while the Navy revealed almost nothing to them. The earliest official statement spoke only vaguely of technical difficulties and promised that the submarine had descended to the ocean floor with all crew still alive. As hours turned into days, problems multiplied. The main Russian rescue mini-submarine, S-34, attempted repeatedly to latch onto the escape hatch positioned above the rear compartment, but could not achieve a proper seal in the difficult sea conditions. Bad weather, strong currents, and persistent equipment failures kept disrupting rescue attempts. As international media coverage intensified and pressure mounted both within Russia and from the outside world, the Russian government faced enormous criticism. The United States, Britain, Norway, and other nations all offered to send advanced rescue systems and experienced divers, but Russian leaders refused for several days, insisting that they had the situation under control. President Vladimir Putin was widely condemned for remaining on holiday at a resort on the Black Sea rather than returning immediately to Moscow to oversee the crisis. It was only on the 5th day after the disaster that Russian authorities finally accepted foreign assistance. A Norwegian ship arrived carrying a modern rescue submarine and some of the world's most experienced deep-water divers. By the time they managed to approach the stern escape hatch and attempt to open it, more than a week had passed since the Kursk sank to the bottom. When they finally accessed the rear compartment, they made a discovery that devastated everyone who heard it. The compartment was completely flooded. There were no survivors. All 118 men aboard the Kursk, officers and enlisted sailors, young men and experienced veterans, sons and fathers and husbands, were dead. For more than a year, the submarine remained sealed on the ocean floor, a massive steel coffin containing not just human remains, but also 2 nuclear reactors, a full complement of cruise missiles, and several torpedoes that had not been accounted for in official statements. It became the focal point of an international debate about Russia's responsibility, the Navy's failures, and what should be done with a nuclear-armed warship resting on the seabed. During this long period, families demanded answers. The Russian government, desperate to restore its credibility after the botched rescue attempt, made a promise. They would raise the entire submarine from the ocean floor. They would recover the remains of every sailor. They would show the world that Russia could accomplish something bold and extraordinary. It was a promise that seemed nearly impossible to keep. The Kursk weighed over 18,000 tons and sat at a depth of 350 feet on soft, unstable seabed. Russia's own salvage equipment had deteriorated from years of underfunding and neglect. The country simply did not have the capability or the financial resources to mount such an operation alone. So the government did something humbling and pragmatic. They contracted with Western companies that specialize in heavy lift salvage operations. In May of 2001, Russia signed an agreement with the Dutch firm Mamoit, experts in lifting massive structures, and Smith International, specialists in salvage and heavy recovery operations. Together, these firms would plan and execute what would become one of the most expensive salvage operations in history. The cost was staggering by Russian standards at the time. Estimates suggested the operation would exceed $70 million, 0 cents, and Russia even appealed to other European nations for financial assistance. The final cost would end up at approximately $65 million, 0 cents or higher, an enormous sum for a country struggling economically, but a necessary expenditure to restore national honor and bring the dead home to their families. From the very beginning, the engineers working on the project understood that this was no ordinary wreck recovery. The hull contained 2 operational nuclear reactors, a complete set of 24 cruise missiles, and an unknown number of torpedoes and warheads still trapped inside the twisted metal of the bow section. Early official statements from the Russian Navy kept changing and contradicting themselves. At first, officials insisted there were no unexploded weapons remaining inside the submarine. Later, they reluctantly admitted that some torpedoes might still be present. This uncertainty created serious danger. Any significant shock or mistake during the lifting operation could potentially trigger another catastrophic explosion or damage the reactor compartments, possibly leading to a nuclear and radiological disaster in the Arctic waters. Environmental organizations like Bellona warned of the potential consequences. If things went wrong, if the hull ruptured, or if weapon systems were jarred into detonation, the Barents Sea could be contaminated with spilled reactor fuel and radioactive material. The challenge facing the salvage teams was unprecedented in scale and complexity. Imagine a steel tube longer than a football field, weighing as much as an entire office building, lying on soft seabed hundreds of feet down in cold Arctic water. You cannot simply wrap chains around it and pull upward like lifting a sunken car from a lake. The submarine's outer shell is not designed to withstand that kind of localized stress. If you attach lifting equipment incorrectly, the hull will tear, twist, or even snap in the middle. If that happened, 2 damaged nuclear reactors, loose missiles, and human remains would scatter across the seabed. The salvage company needed a plan that would treat the submarine as one unified package, lifting it vertically in a completely controlled manner, distributing the load evenly along the entire length of the hull to prevent any bending or stress concentration. There was another serious complication. The explosions had completely destroyed the torpedo room and the inner pressure hull in the bow section. Investigators believed that several warheads and torpedo components were still buried in the twisted metal wreckage at the front. If the salvage team attempted to lift the boat with that damaged section still attached, the weakened bow could tear away halfway through the lift, unbalancing the entire load and risking the snapping of the remaining pressure hull. It could also potentially trigger any unstable explosives still trapped inside the wreckage. After careful deliberation, the team made an extraordinarily difficult decision. The bow section would have to be left behind on the seabed. Only the aft portion of the submarine, which contained the reactors, most of the missiles, and the crew compartments, would be raised to the surface. To separate the bow from the rest of the hull, the salvage workers could not use hand tools or conventional cutting equipment. They needed to make a precise straight cut through extremely thick steel that was already bent, twisted, and torn by the force of the explosion. The solution was ingenious but required working in the most dangerous imaginable conditions. The team installed 2 giant suction anchors into the seabed, one on each side of the submarine hull. A suction anchor is essentially a large hollow steel cylinder that is pressed into the seafloor and then sealed using water pressure to hold it in place like a cup stuck to a smooth surface. Between these two anchors, they strung a special abrasive cable saw, a thick steel rope fitted with hard metal sleeves coated in abrasive grit material. Powerful winches located on each anchor pulled the cable back and forth slowly and deliberately, like a wire saw, chewing through the damaged bow section, millimeter by millimeter. This work was conducted in total darkness, in freezing water, with divers and remote-operated tools moving only feet away from a wreck that was literally packed with explosives and active nuclear material. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the entire operation could end in catastrophe. While the cutting teams worked on separating the bow far below, engineers on shore and aboard support ships focused on the next phase of the operation. They had selected a massive semi-submersible barge called Giant 4 to serve as the main lifting platform. A semi-submersible barge is a specialized vessel with a flat, heavy deck that can be lowered deep into the water by flooding its internal tanks, then raised again by pumping water out. Mammoet refitted Giant 4 with specialized equipment so that the submarine would hang suspended beneath its center rather than resting on top of the deck. On the upper deck, they mounted 26 massive lifting devices called strandjacks. A strandjack is essentially a powerful hydraulic winch that pulls a bundle of steel cables upward a few inches at a time using oil pressure, then mechanically locks the cables in place before lifting again. Each individual strandjack on Giant 4 was rated to lift approximately 900 tons, and all 26 were controlled together by a single integrated computer system that ensured perfectly even distribution of the load. But to connect these jacks to the submarine itself, a profound challenge remained. Divers had to bore and cut a precise pattern of holes directly into the submarine's hull. The Kursk had two distinct layers of steel, an outer shell designed to protect against damage, and a much stronger inner pressure hull that actually contains the water and maintains the crew compartment at survivable pressure when the boat is deep underwater. Workers had to make 26 individual openings that penetrated completely through both of these steel layers, all at carefully chosen points along the entire length of the wreck. Using high-pressure water jets and specialized cutting tools, they worked methodically through both the outer and inner hulls. Around each hole, they installed a guide ring. Later, they lowered specialized steel devices called grippers down through these guide rings. Each gripper functions somewhat like a toggle bolt used to hang a picture on a wall. It would slide through the hole in a narrow configuration, then mechanically open and lock onto the inside of the pressure hull. The lifting cables from the strandjacks were attached to these grippers, ensuring that all the weight would be distributed directly into the strongest part of the submarine structure rather than stressing the thin outer skin. The divers who conducted this extraordinary work did not ascend and descend to the surface in a normal fashion. Instead, they lived continuously in special pressure chambers aboard a support ship called the DS&D Mayo. This system, known as saturation diving, allows experienced deep water divers to remain under pressure for weeks at a time. They would spend approximately 6 hours working on the seabed, then return to the pressurized chamber without ascending all the way to surface pressure, which would be fatal. By late summer of 2001, Giant 4 and the entire flotilla of support ships were in position directly above the wrecked site. The bow section had been separated and left behind. The 26 openings in the hull had been drilled through both layers of steel. The grippers were installed, the lifting cables were in place, and the barge was being held in position by an 8-point mooring system. 8 heavy anchors and powerful winches pulling from different directions to keep Giant 4 fixed precisely above the submarine. Everything was ready. The moment of the lift had arrived. In the early days of October 2001, approximately 14 months after the catastrophic explosions, the salvage team began the most critical operation of the entire project. All 26-strand jacks began simultaneously tightening their steel cables. Slowly, methodically, over the course of many long hours, the 18,000-ton wreck was lifted off the seabed, breaking the grip of accumulated mud and clay that had settled around it over the preceding year. Thousands of tons of force were applied, but it was controlled, distributed, and monitored constantly. Engineers stationed on the support ships watched every gauge, every sensor reading, every instrument that could tell them whether something was going wrong. They were ready to halt the operation immediately if any reading suggested a problem. Radiation monitors were checked repeatedly throughout the lifting process, and the readings consistently showed only normal background radiation levels, confirming that the nuclear reactor section had not been damaged and posed no immediate radiation threat. After roughly 15 hours of continuous controlled lifting, the main aft section of the submarine was successfully hanging beneath Giant 4. It had not ruptured, it had not snapped, the load was stable. Now began the slow journey south toward the Russian coast, with an escort of support ships surrounding Giant 4 like protective guardians, ensuring nothing would go wrong during the transportation. At a naval yard in Rosyakova near Murmansk, Russian workers had prepared one of the world's largest floating dry docks, known as PD-50, to receive this extraordinary and tragic load. The operation was executed with extreme precision. Giant 4, with the Kursk suspended beneath it, was carefully positioned and moved into the floated dry dock. Workers then attached additional floating tanks, called pontoons, to allow the entire assembly to be raised slightly as needed. Once everything was in perfect position, the gates of the dry dock were sealed, and massive pumps began extracting the water. As the water level dropped centimeter by centimeter, the Kursk and Giant 4 slowly settled onto supporting keel blocks and structural supports at the bottom of the dry dock. Only when the wreck was safely and completely supported by these structures did the crew begin releasing the lifting cables and removing the grippers from the hull. For the first time in over a year, the Kursk was no longer a shadow on a sonar screen. It sat in the open air, exposed to bright lights and careful scrutiny inside the enormous concrete structure of the dry dock. Its damaged bow was absent, cut away and left on the ocean floor. Its black paint was scarred and marked by the stresses of the lifting operation. The submarine was now a physical object that could be examined, explored, and from which answers could finally be extracted. Military doctors and forensic investigators established a temporary laboratory at a nearby naval hospital in Severomorsk. This facility would become the repository for everything recovered from inside the Kursk's hull, from technical equipment and classified documents to the human remains of the 118 men who had perished. But even with the boat now in dry dock and the water completely drained away, almost all of the inner compartments remained sealed. No human had passed through those hatches since the moment the crew died. The next phase of the investigation would not involve cranes or massive cables. It would require opening doors that had been closed on the bottom of the sea for over a year, doors that would finally reveal what had happened to the men trapped inside during those final, desperate hours. The moment the Kursk came to rest in the dry dock at Roslyakova, a new and profoundly different kind of investigation began. This was not the work of salvage engineers and heavy equipment operators. This was the domain of forensic pathologists, naval investigators, military historians, and those tasked with the most gruesome but necessary work: cataloging, documenting, and identifying the remains of 118 men. The submarine sat silent and cold in its concrete tomb, its outer hull dark and scored with the marks of its terrible journey from the depths. Russian officials, who had previously made bold proclamations about what had happened, suddenly became less certain. The official narrative that everyone had died instantly in the initial explosions was about to be challenged by evidence that would transform a simple story of technological malfunction into something far more tragic and psychologically complicated. The first challenge was simply getting inside. Many of the internal compartments and hatches had been sealed shut by the explosions themselves, by the damage inflicted by the blasts, and by the simple mechanisms of corrosion and mineral deposits that had accumulated over 14 months on the ocean floor. Specialized teams of workers equipped with cutting torches and hydraulic equipment began the painstaking process of enlarging the holes that had been made during the salvage operation. They carefully cut away sections of the submarine's outer skin and internal structures, working with extreme caution because they did not know with certainty what remained unstable inside. Every compartment had to be treated as a potential hazard. There could still be unexploded ordnance, residual chemical contamination, or structural damage that might collapse and kill workers without warning. The compartments were numbered from front to back, 1 through 10, with the torpedo rooms occupying compartments 1 and 2. When the forward rescue team finally managed to access these spaces, what they found was incomprehensible devastation. The first compartment, where the faulty torpedo had detonated, was completely destroyed. Steel walls had been ripped to shreds, launch tubes had been crushed and twisted as if they were made of paper. The temperature of the explosion had been so intense that metal had melted and fused together. It was clear immediately that no human being had survived in this compartment, no matter what rescue efforts might have been attempted. The explosion had been instantaneous and total. All 12 sailors assigned to the forward torpedo room had been vaporized or killed so completely that identification would later require the use of DNA analysis. But the second compartment, the command center, the nerve center of the entire submarine, told a different story. This space had been occupied by the captain, the senior officers, the sailors who steered the submarine and directed combat operations. All 36 men assigned to the central command post had been in these explosions occurred when the explosions occurred. The first explosion had blown the internal door of the torpedo tube completely off its hinges with such force that it became a deadly projectile, a chunk of solid steel moving like a bullet, which struck the bulkhead separating the first and second compartments. But the internal door did not stop there. It blew completely through and came to rest embedded deep in the wall of the second compartment, 9 meters from where it had started. This told investigators something critical about the force of the explosion. It was tremendous, far more powerful than the official initial estimates. The blast wave that followed immediately after the projectile door had swept through the second compartment with a velocity that research suggested exceeded shock waves from conventional explosions. The men in the command posts did not die from fire or from being shot at by flying metal. They died from blunt force trauma, inflicted by the blast wave itself. A shock wave of sufficient force can kill without leaving visible wounds on the body. It can rupture internal organs, collapse the lungs, and stop the heart in an instant. The bodies of the 36 men in the second compartment were recovered later, many of them remarkably intact despite being dead. They sat or lay in the control room, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and surprise, their hands still positioned at their stations as if they might return to their work at any moment. Some were burned, others bore no visible injuries at all. All were deceased, and there was no evidence that any of them had regained consciousness after the blast. The relief written across their faces suggested they had felt nothing, understood nothing of what had happened. Their deaths, while violent, had been instantaneous and perhaps merciful in its totality. But as investigators and forensic teams moved deeper into the submarine toward the rear compartments, the story changed dramatically. Evidence began to emerge of human struggle, of survival, of choices made and actions taken in those crucial hours after the initial catastrophe. The third compartment was moderately damaged. The fourth compartment was severely damaged. Compartments 5 and 6, the reactor compartments, show damage but had not flooded. These spaces still contained the two operational nuclear reactors, which had cooled automatically when the emergency systems engaged. The radiation levels remained normal. The reactors had not been damaged, but the most compelling discovery came from the 8th and 9th compartments, located at the very stern of the submarine. The 9th compartment was the smallest, barely 30 meters long and just a few meters in diameter. A cylinder of steel that served as the submarine's last-ditch refuge, its final escape pod of sorts. When rescue vehicles finally managed to cut through the hull and divers descended into this compartment with powerful underwater lights illuminating the darkness, they immediately noticed something extraordinary. There was a message, written in pencil on a piece of paper in careful, deliberate handwriting. A note had been left by a survivor. The note was found in the pocket of one of the bodies recovered from the 9th compartment. This note was not written in the minutes immediately after the explosions. The handwriting was relatively controlled and legible. Kolesnikov had written this message approximately 2 hours after the first explosion, after he and the other survivors had managed to navigate through partially flooded and damaged compartments, after they had gathered together, after they had assessed their situation and made their first attempt at salvation. These 23 men had not died instantly. They had survived long enough to think, to plan, to attempt a rescue. They had survived long enough to feel hope, and they had survived long enough to write a message to the world above, a message that was meant to ensure that even if they perished, the circumstances of their death would be known. Polzhnikov's note confirmed what investigators had theorized must have happened in those first terrible minutes. When the first explosion rocked the submarine, the men in the forward compartments had died. But the men in compartments 6 through 10 had survived the initial blast. Some had been injured, some knocked unconscious, but they lived. These sailors had represented the engineering crews, the mechanics who maintained the engines and reactors, the missile technicians, the sailors who worked below decks in the depths of the submarine's hull. When they regained consciousness, when they realized the submarine was sinking and would not surface on its own, these men had undertaken a desperate and extraordinary series of actions. The first thing they did was to use the emergency ballast blow system, an ancient and relatively simple mechanical device designed to force compressed air into the submarine's ballast tanks to increase buoyancy in a crisis. This system had been standard on Russian submarines for decades. The operator would manually open a valve connected to the high-pressure air system. The compressed air would surge into the ballast tanks, displacing the seawater that had entered them during the sinking. With less weight and more buoyancy, the theory went, the submarine would rise toward the surface. But there was a critical problem. By the time the survivors had attempted this emergency blow, the submarine had already sunk too deep, had already filled with too much water, and had come to rest on the seabed. The high-pressure air system, working at full capacity, was not sufficient to overcome the weight and provide enough buoyancy to lift the submarine off the bottom. Their first attempt at escape had failed. The survivors then turned their attention to the chemical oxygen generation system. This was the backup system for generating oxygen when the normal air recycling systems were not functioning. The submarine carried multiple cartridges filled with potassium superoxide, a chemical compound that reacts with carbon dioxide exhaled by humans to produce pure oxygen. This reaction is exothermic, meaning it releases heat while also generating the oxygen needed for survival. Under normal circumstances, a sailor trained in the use of these cartridges would insert them into a special chamber where the reaction took place in a controlled manner and fresh oxygen would flow through the submarine's ventilation system. But nothing about the Kursk situation was normal. The compartments where the survivors were sheltering were dark. Many of them were at least partially flooded with cold seawater. The air they were breathing was already becoming contaminated with carbon dioxide from their own respiration, and the oxygen content was dropping steadily. They knew they had perhaps hours, maybe less, before the air became unbreathable, and they would succumb to hypoxia or carbon dioxide poisoning. They needed oxygen immediately. They needed it urgently. And they had these cartridges, which they believed would save their lives if they could only activate them properly. But the cartridges themselves presented a deadly danger. When a potassium superoxide cartridge begins to react, it generates intense heat and vigorous chemical activity. The reaction must be carefully controlled or it will become dangerous. Normally, these cartridges are handled by trained personnel in a designated space designed to contain them if something goes wrong. But the survivors of the Kursk were desperate. They were in a dark, partially flooded compartment, their air was failing, and they had no way to access the normal oxygen generation systems because so much of the submarine had been destroyed. One of the sailors opened the cartridge. One of the most tragic moments in the history of submarine disasters then occurred. The cartridge, perhaps one of those used in the reaction, fell. Or perhaps it was deliberately placed in the oily contaminated seawater that covered parts of the compartment floor. Accounts differ slightly, but the result was identical. When the potassium superoxide cartridge came into contact with the oily seawater, with the salt and minerals and organic contaminants that filled the water in this tomb, it did not react in a controlled manner. Instead, it detonated. The explosion was violent and immediate. The intense heat from the uncontrolled chemical reaction ignited the oil and other volatile substances in the seawater. A flash fire erupted, a rapidly expanding wall of flame that consumed the limited oxygen in the compartment in a matter of seconds. The fire was not just hot, it was also tremendously toxic. It consumed oxygen so rapidly and completely that the remaining air became composed of carbon dioxide and deadly carbon monoxide. For those who survived the initial flash, death now came through asphyxiation and poisoning. Some reports suggest that several of the sailors died directly in the flames. Others collapsed from the gases. Within moments of that fatal decision to activate the potassium superoxide cartridge, all 23 survivors were dead. When the divers found these bodies weeks later, many of them were severely burned. The soot and ash from the flash fire had settled throughout the compartment like a fine gray dust, turning the interior into a hellscape of death and fire. The divers had to move carefully, aware that they were entering a chamber where the most horrific moment in the lives of these 23 men had taken place. The bodies showed signs of intense thermal exposure. Some were positioned as if they had been running or trying to flee from the flames. Others lay crumpled and still. A few were positioned near the chemical oxygen cartridges, suggesting that even as they were dying, they had been attempting to manage their deadly situation. Koshnikov's body was identified specifically. He was found near the oxygen cartridges, and in his pocket was the note. Investigators realized immediately that Koshnikov must have written the note early in the survival period when there was still hope, when he and the others still believed rescue was coming, when they still had oxygen to breathe and could still function as organized, thinking beings. Then, as oxygen levels dropped, as carbon dioxide and other toxic compounds accumulated in the air, as desperation increased, they had made the decision that would kill them. They had attempted to activate the emergency oxygen system, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. But Kolesnikov's note raised another haunting question. Kolesnikov had written specifically that the accident occurred at 11 hours 30 minutes, meaning 11:30 in the morning. But the actual time of the first explosion had been 11:29 local time. This close correspondence suggested that Kolesnikov's note was written very shortly after the disaster, perhaps within a half hour or at most an hour. If that was true, the 23 survivors had survived much longer than that, at least 5 or 6 hours, possibly more. They had waited in darkness and cold, hoping against hope that rescue would come. They had heard, or possibly heard, rescue vessels moving in the water above them. They had attempted to activate the emergency ballast blow system. They had waded through those long hours, managing the air, rationing the oxygen, staying as calm as possible. Some Russian investigators claimed that the survivors had lasted as long as 3 days, though this was disputed by independent experts who noted that with the compartments partially flooded and oxygen being consumed rapidly, survival beyond perhaps 12 hours was unlikely. The trauma of waiting in total darkness in freezing water, knowing that rescue operations were probably underway, but not knowing whether they would arrive in time, cannot be fully comprehended. These were trained submarine sailors. They understood submarine accidents. They knew the statistics on deep water rescues. They knew that the odds of their survival were very low. But there was one more piece of evidence that would later disturb Russian officials and naval observers around the world. When the investigating commission examined the interior of the second compartment, the command center where the captain and senior officers had been stationed, they found something unexpected. This compartment had a door, a thick steel hatch that separated it from the first compartment. Under normal circumstances, when the submarine was conducting combat operations or undergoing major maneuvers, this door was supposed to be firmly sealed and dogged shut. The regulations were explicit. An open door between the torpedo room and the command center was a safety violation. If an explosion occurred in the torpedo room, an open door would allow the blast and the fire to flow directly into the command post, which is exactly what had happened. The official investigation concluded that the internal tube door was not fully closed at the moment of the explosion. This suggested that the door had been left open in violation of standard operating procedures. The Russian Navy's explanation was that the door had been left open to reduce pressure in the torpedo room during the moment of weapon firing, a procedure sometimes practiced but which violated basic safety regulations. If the door had been firmly sealed and properly dogged shut, the blast wave and fire might not have reached the command post. 36 men might have survived the initial explosion if only the regulations had been followed. This revelation created an enormous uproar within the Russian Navy and among families of the victims. If the regulations had been followed, if the sailors had done their jobs correctly, if someone in a position of authority had enforced safety procedures, many of those men might have survived the initial explosions. They might have had additional hours in which rescue vessels could have reached them. The official investigation into the Kursk would eventually conclude that the explosion was caused by a technical malfunction, the faulty torpedo, and that blame could not be placed on specific individuals. No charges would be filed. No officers would face court-martial. The conclusion was that the disaster was an accident, a simple technical failure that no one could have foreseen. But the families of the 118 dead sailors knew better. They had read the investigative reports. They had seen the photographs of the shattered compartments. They had learned that their loved ones had survived the initial explosions. They had learned that those men had struggled for survival in darkness and cold, that they had attempted rescue operations, that they had written notes hoping that someone would eventually read them and know what had happened. And they had learned that some of those deaths, the 36 men in the command post, might have been prevented if only basic safety regulations had been followed. The blame game that followed the raising of the Kursk would consume Russian naval politics for years and would reshape the way submarines were operated and maintained. As forensic teams continued their grim work cataloging and identifying the remains, other discoveries continued to shed light on the final moments. In the fourth compartment, divers found the remains of several sailors who appeared to have attempted to manually seal watertight doors, trying desperately to prevent the flooding from advancing further aft through the submarine. These men had understood in their final moments that they were fighting a losing battle. But they had fought anyway. It was the duty of a submarine sailor to attempt to save the ship, even when salvation seemed impossible. These men had died trying, their bodies found near the damaged bulkheads and watertight doors that they had attempted to seal. In compartments 8 and 9, the pattern was clearer. The survivors had moved aft, away from the destroyed compartments, toward the stern of the submarine where they had some hope of finding an escape route. The ninth compartment contained the emergency escape pod, a small capsule designed to evacuate up to 10 men at a time in an emergency. But the escape pod had been unreachable. Blocked by flooded compartments and damaged hatches, the survivors had been trapped in their final refuge, unable to escape, unable to call for help on the radio because the radio systems had been destroyed, unable to do anything except wait and hope. Eventually, the forensic examination of the Kursk would be completed, all remaining bodies would be recovered, identified through dental records and DNA analysis, and returned to their families. In the end, Russian divers and international rescue teams recovered 115 of the 118 bodies. 3 remained missing in the bow section that had been left behind on the seabed, buried in the twisted metal wreckage. Of the 115 recovered, approximately 12 bodies showed clear evidence of thermal burns consistent with the flash fire in the ninth compartment. The rest were distributed throughout the submarine's compartments, each death telling a story of those final hours. The investigation would consume months and eventually produce a detailed report that attempted to explain every aspect of the disaster, from the faulty weld in the torpedo to the failures in the rescue operation to the organizational failures within the Russian Navy that had allowed a vessel with known maintenance issues to sail on exercise with live weapons. The report was harsh in its assessment of the Russian Navy's readiness, maintenance procedures, and training protocols. It documented how budget cuts had affected everything from the quality of weapons manufacturing to the frequency of training exercises. It showed how crews that had gone months without being paid were expected to maintain and operate the world's most sophisticated military equipment. It revealed a Navy that was technically competent on paper, but operationally deteriorating through neglect and underfunding. But perhaps the most important legacy of the investigation was what it revealed about the men who died aboard the Kursk. They had not died passively or in panic. They had attempted rescue procedures. They had written messages for posterity. They had even attempted to activate oxygen systems in a desperate bid for survival, knowing the risks but willing to take them. They had been professional sailors, trained and capable, doing their duty even in the face of impossible circumstances. Their courage in those final hours was evident in every recovered body, in every piece of evidence, in the careful deliberation evident in Kolesnikov's handwriting on that note. These were not men who had given up. These were men who had fought to the very end and who had hoped, right until the moment of that final flash fire, that rescue would somehow come and that they would see their families again. When,